Okay, tonight's talk is James Woolford, there he is, on RNAS Mullion balloon site and the role that Mullion played in World War I. So without further ado, I shall hand you over to James. Shall we give him a round of applause?
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm not using a microphone, so hopefully you can all hear me. Okay? I will speak up. If we could have questions at the end, so that'll keep the flow going, and then I'll be able to finish and get you home in a reasonable time. What we want to talk about is Mullion balloon site. Now, some people around are sort of even not too sure where it is or what it was, but location-wise, it's up at Benython. And basically, where the wind turbines are now at Curie Cross Lanes, that's exactly the location that it was. So it's back up right next to the Downs. It's almost part of the Downs there. But what we want to talk about is the important part that it played. I mean, everyone thinks it was a balloon site. That's what they know it as. It had airships there in the First World War. You wonder about the effectiveness of them. They were pretty sort of crude, sort of Victorian looking things, so like something out of H.G. Wells. But it played a really important part in the First World War. The submarine offensive from the Germans was playing a terrible toll, and their attempts were to basically starve us out of the war, and they almost succeeded. You look at the figures. The total, I would refer to some facts here. Between the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, so the Austro-Hungarians, their submarine fleets were down in the Mediterranean, but between the two of them, they sunk 14,200,000 tons of shipping around the world. That's sort of 2,000 odd British merchant ships. By 1917, the German submarines had sunk 30% of the merchant shipping fleet in the world. So they were a huge threat. And, you know, there was a real risk that they were going to win the war simply by starving us out because of all the materials, the war materials and the food that came from the Empire and from America to keep the war going. The U-boats themselves suffered a huge loss. The total number of U-boats that the Germans had was 372 throughout the whole of the First World War. They lost 178 of those by mainly enemy action. Occasionally they ran into their own mines that they'd laid, which, you know, a bit unfortunate. But they lost 5,000 men in their submarines. So, you know, this was quite an important thing that was going on. And of course, the biggest tragedy that became well known was the sinking of the Lusitania. That was 7th of May 1915. There were 1,960 people on board that, and 1,197 were killed. And that was a submarine torpedo attack off Southern Ireland there. So these submarines were a really important part of the German war, and they were a real problem as part of the Allied war. So comes along the Royal Naval Air Service, come along to tackle this problem with airships. Aeroplanes were, as we'll see in a minute, not that effective by that stage. And these blimps, I suppose some people call them, they were, the proper name is they were non-rigid airships. And that was what was based at Mullion. That was what Mullion was set up for. And also, we'll include the courage of the men that flew them, because these were by modern standards, incredibly dangerous things. They actually didn't kill as many people as you might expect, but they were the people who flew them were you know, courageous and very skilled as well. So we'll have a look into that. Right, straight in here we've got a picture. That is Mullion balloon site, taken probably, I would guess it was fairly well developed by that time, so probably by the end of 1917, something like that. Again, up here, this is the access road, so that comes in off the Curie Cross Lanes Double Lodges Road. There's quite a big access there still, and that goes into the where the turbines are now. But that came in, and you can see there's a lot of building here. I believe this was the power station down the bottom there. That I think was the station headquarters. But also you had these two very large sheds. And interesting, if you ever get it in a pub quiz, airships are kept in sheds. Aeroplanes are kept in hangars. No idea why. They always called airships sheds. So those are the two airship sheds. The biggest one of those is something like 300 feet long. So I worked that out. That's probably about 4 or 5 times longer than this room or more. And that was the sort of length we're talking. 190 feet the airships, the bigger airships were. So they were pretty big things. And then a slightly smaller shed, this one here. There was also enough area here to land and take off aeroplanes. Down here you can see that is a hangar, and you can see there are 4 little aeroplanes parked there, because there were some aeroplanes kept there as well. This I think is a mooring block, just a large lump of concrete in the ground that they could tie the airships down to. By this stage there was, I believe, about 25 officers and something like 340 men stationed there. That, as I understand it, was the number of people in the Royal Navy, the naval personnel. And I do know that there was a lot of people from the village here who worked up there, and I'd spoken to somebody in the past who worked on the power generation site there. So that's the site, and that's, you know, it's quite an extensive construction there. The building started in 1916, so it's a couple of years into the First World War. And they started in March. The first shed was up there being assembled and erected by June. And so they're moving on quite well. And the first airship arrived, well, the first airship was actually sent down from Kingsnorth up in near the Medway towns, but it didn't make it, and unfortunately it crashed into the sea off Start Point, which was a bit of a disaster for them. The second airship, and the one we're going to talk about, the coastal airship C9, they sent down on the train. That arrived safely. Right. There's a bit of history here. These are the airships that were basically flew there. But the balloon, though, as far as I know, balloons never flew from Mullion. But all the pilots and all the crew were trained on balloons. And they would have had their training at Wormwood Scrubs. Not the prison, because there was a Royal Naval Air Station right next to the prison in Wormwood Scrubs on the common there. And this was a pretty, how could I say, adventurous sport in those days, because once you released one of these balloons, you were completely at the mercy of the elements. The balloon went up and the wind blew, and you went where the wind blew. Not knowing where you were going to land the thing or how you were going to land it. And they flew in quite strong winds, in sort of 25, 30 mile an hour winds. So you covered quite a bit of ground. There are various problems, and we'll get into a bit about how you fly one of these balloons. But one of the problems is you fill it up with hydrogen, or in those balloons as well, they used coal gas occasionally, because the old-fashioned coal gas was lighter than air. It wasn't as good as hydrogen, but the best ones, you filled it up with hydrogen, and you'd have to balance it so that it was just buoyant, so that it would just lift. And that was done by throwing out ballast, either sand or water, or if it got really desperate, you threw out everything else you had. So they would get the thing so it was positively buoyant, and it would rise up in the air, release it. But the problem is, as it rose up in the air pressure around drops, the hydrogen expands, so it goes up even faster. And you have to then start, when you get to the height you want, you have to start releasing hydrogen. So you've got to let the gas out to maintain the height. But there are also other problems involved in that, because if the sun comes out, it warms up the balloon, the hydrogen expands, so you go up. So if the sun comes out, you've got to let more hydrogen out to stop it going up. But of course, the other way around, if it rains, it gets wet and it comes down. So immediately, it's not the safest, it's not the easiest thing to fly. And obviously, if it comes down, if it's descending, you've got to throw out ballast. When it comes to land, when you've actually gone as far as you want to, and they would go 20 or 30 miles, depending which way the wind was blowing, they would throw out a trail rope. There was about a piece of rope, a couple of 100 feet long, and the idea was it would drag on the ground and slow you down. If you were lucky, it might tangle up in a hedge or a tree, and that would bring you to a halt. And then they had a shorter rope, which was a grapple rope, which had an iron multi-prong grapple on it. And the idea was that would dig into the ground, and you'd be able to release more gas, get the thing to descend, hopefully nice and gently, and come to a safe stop. Hopefully in a field, but of course it could be, by this time, you're not too sure, you could end up somewhere quite exciting. So these balloon pilots, or they were called balloonatics, but the balloon pilots started off probably from somewhere like Wormwood Scrubs was one of their main ones. Having got their pilot's license on free balloons, they would then go off to Cranwell, which became famous as an RAF training college and still open, I believe, where they would learn to fly airships. Now, these are the airships which actually served at Mullion. That one is a submarine Scout, a very simple, comparatively simple, one engine, 2 crew in this open gondola down here. It had 60 to 70,000 cubic feet of hydrogen in it, and was 143 feet long, so it's good size. They then developed that to the Submarine Scout Zero, so SSZ, and that was a slightly better one. Still one engine. You had 3 crew in that one, and the other difference was the Submarine Scout could carry 160 pounds weight of bombs. So that was their main offensive armament. They also had a Vickers machine gun in there as well, and they would carry a camera at certain times. The Zero, though, was quite a success, and there was a lot of those. They built in total 66 of the Zeros against 36 of the Scouts. That's the total number. But we come along to probably what was the most successful airship, and that is the Coastal class, and that's got a C on it. You can see they put SSZs or Cs. That was the one which was probably the most successful. They built 35 of those, and those are the ones we're going to talk about, because we're going to talk about a flight on one of those Coastal class airships. 170,000 cubic feet of hydrogen in it, and 195 feet long. But they could carry 450 pounds weight of bombs, which isn't actually an awful lot in terms of the sort of damage you could do to a submarine, or how close you've got to drop that to a submarine to be effective. And finally down here, they improved. The Coastal class were just a big sausage shape, were like sort of 3 sausages together. They improved them enormously with the C Star class, and that was apparently easier to fly. And there was 22 of those built in total. What else can we say about Mullion? 320 acres there. Like I say, end of 1916, because it was only started in 1916, there were 13 officers and 200 ratings. And one of the things you'll see we'll come on to is the number of people that you actually needed to launch these airships. They were terribly unmanageable on the ground. They also had, which was probably as dangerous as anything else, they had a hydrogen production facility there, so they could generate their own hydrogen. And it was a process, they mixed a couple of chemicals together, one of which was caustic soda. This sill-coal process in a big reactor, and you put water in it and a couple of chemicals. It got very hot. It produced hydrogen and steam. You didn't want the steam, that wasn't any good to you, but it produced the hydrogen gas. But the big problem was that it was hot. Once it had finished producing gas, you had to empty it out very quickly before it cooled down. And there was a lot of problem with dermatitis with the people working the plant, because you get caustic soda and these chemicals on you, and it caused a lot of problems with skin conditions. So that was obviously not a particularly nice job to get involved with. A lot of the officers and men were housed up there as well, although I have heard, again, there's stories of people who lodged, officers who lodged in the village and who came to the village every night at their lodging. And in total, overall, over the whole period of the war, there were 12 of the SS class, the submarine scout class submarines, and 5 of the coastal class, and 2 of the Sea Coastal Star class. So that was not there all at the same time, but we'll see how they managed those. Also, there were fixed-wing aeroplanes there. To some extent, they were what this one is the DH-6, and had pretty much become redundant on the front. It would carry 2 people, and for the duties that they were doing, which was submarine spotting and coastal patrols, you needed a pilot, you needed an observer. But the problem was, if you had 2 people in it, you couldn't carry any bombs. It wasn't capable of carrying the weight. So they used to go out on what they called scarecrow patrols, and again, any submarines or enemy craft would see them and would be frightened by them effectively. That was the idea. They then had the Sopwith 1.5 Strutter came along. That was used again for patrolling and also for some survey type work, photographing coastal defences and things like that, making sure that the camouflage was good. And then eventually the DH-9 came along, which was classed as a light bomber, so they could be far more effective in tackling submarines. And a bit more about it, we see some the way that they worked was you had Mullion as the main base, and they had the main sheds, but they also ran some satellite stations as well. So they had one up at Bude, and this is Bude here, and you can see it's a pretty temporary. The accommodation is in tents, and the idea was that they could have a lot more airships than you could keep just at Mullion, and they were tucked away in trees. And these are the submarine scout class. From Bude, obviously, they could start working into the Bristol Channel. This one, I'm not too sure where it is, but I have seen some reference that said that they actually had some of these mooring out stations at Bachim. Now, that's something, interesting bit of local history, be worth, but Bachim is mentioned as a mooring out station. So this was a way. They also had one at Toller, which is up near Bridport in Dorset, Lara near Plymouth, and the one at Bude. Towards the end of the war, they were also setting one up on St Mary's on the Isles of Scilly. I'm not too sure whether that was actually ever commissioned, but there certainly was, you know, later on they were doing that. A couple of pictures down here. These are the control cars of the coastal class. The first thing you notice is there's always a lot of people around, and this is all part of the launching crew. Apparently when an airship was due to be launched or had arrived back and was due to be manhandled back down onto the ground again, somebody would go round, or a couple of people would go round the site with bugles, and all personnel would come out from whatever they were doing to come and handle the airships. You've got two engines, one at each end of, actually, it was two aeroplane fuselages joined back to back. There was 5 cockpits in there, and it was just, you can see it's an open cockpit. So it's out in the draft of the propeller slipstream. At this stage, they had 250 horsepower Sunbeam engines. Now, they weren't very reliable. And one of the problems was, apparently, is that the magnetos for engines before the First World War were all made in Germany. And when the war started, of course, the supply of magnetos stopped. They had to start using British magnetos, and the magnetos weren't that reliable. So they would carry a couple, at least 2 spare magnetos, and the engineer would change them actually while they were in flight. So when an engine failed, they could actually put a new magneto on it. I hate to say they might have been Lucas, because Lucas never had a very good reputation for reliability. And again, you can see a bit more here. There's a couple of landing skids underneath it. You'll see some other pictures. Another significant thing is it's air duct here. Now, the airships, different to the balloons, they had little tiny balloons. They had 4 small balloons within the airship envelope. Now, the envelope kept its shape only because of the pressure of the gas in it. There was no rigid structure. I mean, the rigid airships, like sort of the R100 and things, they had a structure outside that kept the shape, and then you had hydrogen bags inside. These were just a big bag of hydrogen. And to keep the pressure in there, they had, because you couldn't put more hydrogen to blow it up, they had these, what they call ballonettes, and they were 4 inflatable compartments in there, basically, and you blew those up to keep the pressure of that whole thing up. And if you had to release hydrogen, you had to put more air in to keep the shape. And that was really quite a critical part of flying these things. And they had this air scoop here, and a bit later on we'll talk. Originally, they put the air scoop here. So this is one of the later ones, modified. And they used the draft, effectively, and the airflow from the front propeller to push air in to these ballonettes. They could allow air in, they could let air out. That was part of the controls. But it wasn't very effective. And we'll see later what one of the problems. So it was moved to the after engine, which quite often on patrol they'd stop the front engine anyway if they were just going at fairly slow speeds. So that's it. You can just see it's got a rudder at the back, and we'll see from the shape of it why it wasn't very aerodynamic, really, and the problems that were involved in flying the thing. And sticky paper. Right. So we're going to talk about a particular flight. That's to talk about one flight on one day in 1917, and to give you just a flavour of how skilled and how brave these people were to be flying these things at all. So we're talking about, again, the coastal class of airship. And there we have, there's a couple of pictures there. there's the airship we're going to talk about, and the hangar at Mullion. So you can see by some sort of scales of how big it is. It's also difficult to see on this picture, but there's probably 100 or more people under here bringing it out. Now, to start the flight in the morning, you'd have to get first off, they used to tie the airship down. It had to be fairly well tied down in the shed. But they would start the engines. They'd run up the engines inside the shed. Apparently it was pretty fearsome noise, but that was to check the engines, so they'd get them warm, run them up. Then you'd have to ballast the balloon. So again, you want it to be just buoyant. So that would involve a lot of people holding on to the side. They'd put hydrogen into it. They'd maybe have to take ballast out of it or let it out. And obviously it was all loaded up with the bombs that were going out that day with it. They had bomb racks underneath the control car. Loaded up with the bombs. They had a total, if they wanted to, of 3 Sterling machine guns, Vickers machine guns, which they could use. They had, the original fit was 2 in the car, and they had this really rather bizarre arrangement. They had a tube up through the middle of the balloon to a little, I suppose you call it a lookout, but a cockpit on top with a machine gun on top. And that was the idea of that was if they were going to be attacked by aircraft. Well, actually, down here, they were completely out of range of any German aircraft anyway, so that wasn't used. So they would sometimes carry the 3 machine guns in the car. I think normally it was 2. And the start of the war, they had 3 crew in. The flight we'll be talking about, by that time, they'd got 4 crew members in there. But you see, it was a rather strange shape. It was a trilobe shape like that. It didn't add to its aerodynamic capabilities, but it was actually quite smart because the car hung from the top lobe, so they were able to put the car further to the top. Didn't have to have such long wires on it. And you'll see back here, you've got the controls look rather ineffectual, and they were. So it wasn't a particularly easy airship to actually fly. Right, I think, we've talked about the sizes of it. The roles that it went out on were escort duties for the convoys that were coming up the channel. And by the time we're talking about, they just about got the coordination right. In the early stages, they weren't running convoys, and the merchant ships were very, very prone to attack. Once they got convoys protected by naval vessels, it became far safer, so they weren't getting the same number of attacks. When they got convoys protected by naval vessels and an airship as well to provide air cover and spot for submarines, it became even more safe for them. So as convoy, they actually went out hunting for submarines, just looking for submarines, and they started to get more coordinated then with the reports that were coming in from other ships. They did have a radio. They had wireless telegraphy on board, so one of the duties was a wireless operator. So they were quite sophisticated, if you like. They were getting the technologies there, so they could talk to ships. They had basic ways of communicating. Was they had the wireless telegraphy, so they could radio back. That also allowed them to do radio navigation. They were able to get fixes for where they were, which was again quite advanced for the time. They had an Aldis lamp, so they could signal to ships with a flashing light. They used semaphore, the old semaphore flag codes, again close signalling to ships. And they were even, there's one case I read about where there were some survivors in a lifeboat, and they flew low past them and shouted to them. They actually hailed them being shouted at by an airship. So that is the coastal class airship. The duration, they had enough fuel for about 13, 14 hours flying, which was, and later on, I mean, they were doing even longer flights than that. Right. The value of these airships against submarines was more this fear factor. They could drop bombs on them. The bombs weren't that effective. At this stage of the war, at the end of the war, they started to get depth charges with proper hydrostatic fuses on them, so they could set them to detonate at a certain depth. What the bombs they were using, they had time delay bombs. They were 2.5 second time delay. So after it hit the water, it sank for 2.5 seconds and then exploded. And hopefully it was somewhere near the submarine. Unlikely though. And they were relying very much, by the time they'd seen a submarine and got there, the thing had usually crash dived. They could sometimes, if it had just released a torpedo, they could see where the bubbles started for the torpedo, because of the engine systems in those. And they could drop bombs where the submarine, where they thought it was. But beyond getting a direct hit, you're talking about the small bombs they were dropping were 65 pounders, not very big. The larger bombs they had were 100 pounders. So you really had to get it clinking off the hull of the submarine if you're going to do the submarine any damage. But the important thing was the submarines were seen. They were forced to submerge. Although the bombs might not have been that effective, it was probably pretty unpleasant to be in a submarine with any sort of bomb going off anywhere near you in the sea. So that kept them down. And the other thing was that the submarines of the day, they obviously, when they were submerged, they had electric power. They could travel 4 or 5 knots speed underwater. They got faster towards the end of the war, but probably only 4 or 5 knots. That's pretty much flat out underwater. And they couldn't do it for very long, probably only an hour or an hour and a half on batteries. They could travel probably 30 or 40 miles at a couple of knots underwater, so they could get out of the way, but they weren't effective. They were slow, they weren't effective. On the surface, submarines could do probably 7 knots, 8 knots, but they needed that because the way they attacked ships was you found a ship, then you had to overtake it and then lay in wait for it. So the overtaking bit had to be done on the surface, and if an airship happened to spot you, you were forced to dive. That completely negated your attack. So that was the value of the airships. They weren't actually, although they were credited with sinking some submarines, as we'll see, it wasn't always the case. Now, we're talking about this coastal ship C9. Most of its flying was done by this gentleman here, who became, at the end of the war, he was Major James Gardner. He was a flight commander at the time we're talking about, and he was decorated for this. This side here, here's the gentleman in question. There's James Struthers, and this is obviously looking backwards. The contrast is not that brilliant here, but you can see the important things to note is they're dressed up warm, because they were flying right the way through the summer and the winter. There's cases noted when they got back to Mullion that they actually have to be lifted out by the ground crew because they were too cold. They were just absolutely frozen. There's a couple of the other, well, of the 4 of them, obviously there's one taking the photograph. Back here you can see the wireless operator and the mechanic, the air mechanic. Also interesting to note that there was no obvious way of getting from the front to the back. There were just a number of cockpits there. And apparently, if you wanted to get, and particularly the mechanic might want to go to the front engine to work on that, you climbed outside, stood on the handrails at the bottom and worked your way along and climbed back in again while you're flying around. So yeah, quite a dedicated thing to want to do that. They were also they were sent off with pretty meagre rations as well. So given that they're going out for 12 hours or something like that, they gave them a few salt bacon sandwiches, some Horlicks tablets, and a bar of chocolate, well, and a small thermos flask of hot drink, of chocolate or tea. So they didn't look after them that well. And you can see here, here's James Struthers. He's got, you can't see it very well, but he's got binoculars in his hand there. This on the side here, I think, is a camera in this case. They did carry cameras to do survey work. It isn't obvious in this photograph where the machine guns were, but they were obviously operated from his, they had mountings on the side. So whether they were kept in the cars when until they were needed, I don't know. And this is the wider crew. This one is James Struthers here and his crew, which changed slightly over the years. But in this case, we're talking about the second officer. They carried a pilot and a second pilot. So that was Flight Sub-Lieutenant Arthur Jelf. There's a coxswain, who he was in charge of the rudder and the elevator. And that was Petty Officer Charles Regan. And Petty Officer Wireless Telegraphist, it's a G. Ellis, whether it was George, I'm not too sure, and an engineer mechanic. He was leading mechanic Soames. So those would have been the gentlemen in here. And you can see James Struthers here in his picture. So here we have a coastal class, and going along, and obviously a convoy here in escorting. Now, on the particular day we're talking about, the 21st of September 1917, these gentlemen here were busy fighting the U-boats. The third Battle of Ypres was going on at the time. So that's what was sort of going on the Western Front. So they started very early in the morning, because one of the things, again, the submarines, they tended, well, because of the airships to a great extent, they were forced to attack very early in the morning or at night, or in bad weather, which made it harder for them, made them less accurate in their warfare. So at 5 o'clock in the morning, the airship is out and airborne. So it's been manhandled out into the middle of the field there. They've done all the ballasting. Now, the other thing with these, which you didn't get with balloons, was you could fly them like an aeroplane, because if you gave them forward speed with the engine, if you pitched them up, they would get aerodynamic lift, and if you pitched them down, they would go down. So you could fly a heavy airship by pitching it up. And this one's pitched up a little bit. But you have got this problem of balancing your ballast with your hydrogen, with the speed as well, so you can fly the thing high or low with our aerodynamic forces. You've also got to trim it to get the front ballonets right trim with the back. So if you put more air in the back, the nose will come up and it'll sit with the nose high. If you put more air in the front, it's just basically moving the hydrogen around backwards and forwards. And you've got to keep the pressure right. They had, the figures were that they had 20 millimeters of pressure was the lowest it should be. 25 was the operating pressure. 30 was high pressure, which is not a big difference. This is to keep the envelope the right shape, basically. Once it got up to 35, it was classed as overpressure, and by the time it got to 40, it was starting to, there were automatic valves that would release hydrogen before it actually split or did any damage. So that was also something you had to balance. So you're keeping an eye on the pressure, and you're balancing that with the air in the ballonets to keep the airship shape. You're keeping the pitch right, which you've got control of the pitch with the elevators there. That's one of the jobs of the coxswain. So it isn't a simple thing. And like I said before, flying in Cornwall in our nice, April showers, you go into the sunshine, it all warms up, the thing wants to go up. So are you going to release hydrogen for that? Because the next thing, you're going to go into a shower cloud, and then it's going to get heavy, and it's going to want to come down again. You've got the buffeting of turbulence and winds. Apparently they were really pretty nasty things to fly in bad weather. And they did fly them in bad weather. They flew them in, coming back in sort of 40 knots, 45 knots of wind. They would get the whole station out to manhandle them. They would, so it wasn't an easy thing. So anyway, right. So C9 leaves Mullion at 5 o'clock in the morning. Dawn is actually at 5:32 that morning. So they go off the Lizard. They're doing just a general patrol, looking for submarines. But what they do see at 5:30 in the morning, 30 minutes later, they see a French steamer called the Quang-Si, 10 miles south of the Lizard Point. She's just been hit by a torpedo, by a submarine, but hasn't been sunk. She's been disabled but not sunk. So the wireless telegraphist radios back in to Mullion and says, there's a crippled ship out here, and they arrange then from there, there's a tow comes out from Falmouth. But in the meantime, James Struthers sets the ship up in a circular spiral search around and around from this vessel to look for the submarine which has actually just torpedoed it. Now the submarines like to hang around. They might go below water, but they like to hang around to, obviously in that case it hadn't sunk, so they would have tried to send another torpedo to sink it. It was a French passenger steamer which apparently didn't have any passengers on board. It was in ballast, and it was from La Rochelle and was going to New York. Why it was going empty, I'm not too sure. But it was quite a good size, 6,400 ton vessel. Fortunately, there were no casualties on that one, but I would imagine the torpedo had perhaps hit the steering gear or the propellers or something like that, because it was crippled. It was dead in the water. At 10:44 hours, they spot a conning tower of a submarine. This is now 15 miles southeast of the Lizard, and it's on the northeasterly course. It's basically coming back at speed again on the surface to get itself ready for another attack as this ship is being towed into Falmouth. Obviously, seeing the submarine, they radio that they've spotted a submarine, so that other ships are alerted, and they head towards it. Well, of course, the submarine sees them, crash dives, and at 10:50 hours, they drop 2 100-pound bombs just 300 metres ahead of the last sighting of the periscope. That was their way of saying, that's the way it's going, we'll try and drop a bomb on it. They claimed, they saw bubbles and oil coming to the surface. There seemed to be a fairly normal claim that they saw oil. 12:40, a trawler, Fusilier, arrived. They call them trawlers, they were actually naval boats. They requisitioned a lot of trawlers to use as minesweepers. So as a boat came which had depth charges itself, and followed by a L-class destroyer, Laverock, and another couple of airships came out from Mullion, C2 and C23A. So you've now got 3 airships and a couple of ships on the hunt for this submarine. At 13:15, Struthers, having dropped his bombs, said, I've got to go back to Mullion for refuel and more bombs. So he leaves the area and comes back at 1700 hours at 5 o'clock. So they bring it back. And then they reported that they've seen an oil slick about 16 miles off the Lizard. And the Laverock went and swept. They had these paravanes, so it was like a minesweeper. They swept the area to try and find it. They dropped depth charges on this, and they claimed that they saw large quantities of oil coming up, and it was signalled that they, as far as they were concerned, they had sunk the submarine. So they've undoubtedly sunk the submarine. And the Kuang-si, the passenger vessel, that was successfully towed to Falmouth. The next day, they carried on searching for the submarine, and the report from Struthers was that the submarine was hit and believed sunk. But it wasn't. They were credited with sinking this, but obviously as the war progressed, the sort of history showed that the submarine, it was boat UC-48, and it was captained by Oberleutnant Sir C. Kurt Ramian. Now he'd sunk about 50 odd ships with this submarine, and so he, you know, it's one of those things. I mean, it's difficult to know the mind of somebody who can go, you know, doing that much damage, particularly to civilian vessels. But the submarine turned up again, actually in Spain, in El Ferrol in Spain. It was damaged by depth charges and had to basically give itself into a free port there. He ended up back in Germany and ended up on another submarine, and we captured him, and he was made a prisoner of war. So he survived it. The captain of the submarine did survive that. So that was an indication, really. They spent a lot of time dropping bombs and depth charges on this thing, but hadn't actually hit it. And where the oil came from is a bit of a mystery, because there's a lot of these cases where they dropped bombs on submarines and saw oil on the surface, but the submarine actually got away. So quite what they produced the oil from, I'm not too sure. Struthers, on the 28th of September, by this time he'd flown something like 1,000 hours in airships. He was quite an experienced captain, and he was noted that he actually tried to get in the mind of the submarine, of the captain of the submarine. He did a lot of study on this thing about, you know, the fact that the speed they could go underwater, the fact that they had to be up on the surface to make their attacks or to position themselves for attacks. So he did a lot of work like that and became quite an expert. He even encouraged the people from the naval people from the destroyers, etc., to come and fly in the airships, so that they got a feeling of what it was like from the airship's point of view. And he himself went in some British submarines to get some experience of that. So he was quite a thinking man's balloon pilot, really, in terms of the way he did. He was awarded a Distinguished Service Cross in 28th September. And in February 1918, he got another 2 bars to the DSC. And the short history of his life was that he left. He relinquished the command of C9 in December 1917 and went off to Kingsnorth to fly a North Sea airship. So he went back and ended up. He was born in Scotland. So he ended up actually in the airship service up in Scotland at the end of the war. And the dear old airship C9, she was known as the darling of the fleet because she was one of the longest surviving airships. Had 806 days service, which is, you know, well over 2 years flying service. Flew something like 2,500 hours, and that averaged out at sort of 3 hours a day. And it was claimed that she was never actually unavailable for service, that, you know, it worked every day. So that's an indication of the fact that they weren't quite as dangerous as they might seem to be. They did last well, and they, you know, they didn't have an awful lot of people shooting at them, if you know what I mean. There were a couple of cases where submarines did try and return fire to them, but they were out of the range of any German aeroplanes, so they weren't getting attacked like that. So that's really the bit of the flight. I'm not going to leave you there, because when we come along there, there is a particular incident which is well noted in Mullion. And this is our dear old airship C9 in her early days. And this is, it's actually the 23rd of July, because she set off on the 22nd. This picture, everyone sees this as the airship that crashed at Mullion Harbour. And there's all sorts of tales that are told. I've heard that it was shot down by British aircraft, that it was shot down by ground fire on the Channel Isles, by friendly fire, and all sorts of tales. So I got digging on this one, because there's actually a picture on the wall over there, I think, of this. It's well known. So I got a bit of digging on this. Now, our Flight Lieutenant James Struthers was the captain in charge of this on this particular day. He was just a flight lieutenant then. He was a flight commander by the time the other flight we talked about. His coxswain on the day was gentleman Jerry Long. I presume he was petty officer. The air mechanic was a Mr. Corbett, and the wireless telegraphist was Mr. Ellis, who's the same one who stayed with him. So this was a Saturday, and the airship left Mullion at 12:30 p.m. So after lunch. So they were on patrol looking for. At this stage, they weren't coordinating the effort very well, so they were just gone out to hunt for submarines, to hunt for German submarines. And the account is that I've got here, and I'm pretty certain it's got to be true, because it was actually written, it's reportedly written by Jerry Long, so he was the coxswain on the boat, so this should be the proper story. So they headed off to the south, as he says, in fine style. They're obviously fairly high spirits, searching for U-boats. They went right the way across the channel, and apparently Struthers said to the crew, he said, in about half an hour's time we should reach the French coast, so keep your eyes peeled for it. I think the visibility wasn't brilliant, and there was some quite strong winds from the north. Well, anyway, after an hour they hadn't sighted the French coast, and the suggestion was that perhaps they should get this wireless telegraphy fix. So they got a position fix. The position that they were given was not even on their chart, and they were well off to the west. So they set course to the east, now looking for France, and the first thing they saw was the Isle of Ushant, which is off the Brest Peninsula. So they're fairly well down, and like he says, we're almost in Sea Area Biscay down there. So they've gone, quite a long way off track. So anyway, they set off. They now know where they are. So they set back for Mullion, set course for Mullion, and resume the patrol. Shortly after that, the forward engine, our dear old Sunbeam engine, gave trouble, and they had to stop it. One of the problems, as I was saying before, this air scoop that pressurised the ballonets was originally in front of the front engine, or just behind the front engine, so it was in the front. So they've now got an engine that stopped, so they can't use the pressure from that to inflate the ballonets to keep the airship shape right. But never fear, they've got a little auxiliary air blower, a little 2.5 horsepower motor and an air blower, which they can use. So they keep the airship inflated with air from this air blower. Unfortunately, after a short time, the air blower broke down as well. So they've now got no front engine, no air blower, and they aren't able to keep the pressure in the ballonets to keep the airship. The airship then slowly starts to deflate, I would imagine they probably leaked hydrogen anyway. They were a fabric, a rubberized fabric, which was then painted with cellulose paint. So they probably weren't all that hydrogen tight anyway. And the trouble was with these particular airships, as they lost pressure, they bent in the middle like a banana. And having bent in the middle, the control surfaces in the back then didn't work properly. So you're really in a crippled airship. To add insult to injury, as the further it bends, the control car then starts to tilt onto its side, so it all gets very uncomfortable as well. So they're now in this crippled airship, and it's getting dark. It is dark by now. I believe they kept the rear engine running to best thing they could do, but they basically spent a very, very uncomfortable night just drifting around. In the morning, when it got light, they were fortunate enough to see a destroyer, which they signalled with an Aldis light, flashing light, and the destroyer came underneath them, and they managed to drop their trail rope, this big long rope, down onto the destroyer's deck, and he gave them a tow. So they were then, because I mean this is somewhere out in the middle of the channel, so it's a good long tow. They towed them back. It was foggy that morning apparently as well, and they said it was a rather bizarre. He describes it as really strange because they couldn't see the destroyer that was towing them, so they were just floating around in this sort of damp patch of fog, and all they could hear was various sort of foghorns of other vessels, and they would sort of, you know, so that was all a bit strange. As they got the Cornish coast in sight, the destroyer then turned to head for Mullion, to Mullion Island, because Mullion knew, they'd radioed ahead, so Mullion knew that there was problems and what was happening. So they were coming into the harbour. But as they went crosswind, the thing then blew down onto the water, so they're now being dragged through the water as well, so they're getting thoroughly wet in there. By this stage they're close enough to Mullion, and the boats that had been notified, so he said a small flotilla of boats came out from Mullion and resumed the tow and rescued them out of the control cars. And the airship was then towed back to Mullion. And you can see they deflated the airship, and it was put on a lorry, taken back to the base. They then reinflated it, fixed the engine, and as far as I know, the thing was flying again, back on service within a day or so. So it looks far worse than it was. But Jerry Long said that he was most relieved to be on dry land, and wrapped in blankets. He was taken back for a very large breakfast and a good sleep at Mullion Balloon Site. They'd been in the air for 19 hours by that time, so it was quite a lucky escape for them. But that, as far as I know, is the true story. It didn't happen in the harbour, it was towed in there, and the airship was back in the air and back in service and on patrol straight away. So hopefully that's given you some sort of flavour of what was going on up there, and the importance. And they really did have a big influence. And obviously Mullion was a very important location for getting out into the southwest approaches, and harassing the submarines to stop them causing such lethal damage. So it was, you know, a very important thing. And hopefully you also got a flavour of how brave those men were to be doing their service in these things, and how crude they were. I mean, it was a very, very developing technology. I mean, submarines were crude in those days. This was a technology which, unfortunately, it's a bit of a shame really. The airship got itself a bad name through the R100 and the Hindenburg, but it was, you know, it was developing into quite a practical form. Unfortunately, the hydrogen was a bit of a problem. So I say, there we are. Thank you very much.